John Kennedy kicked off Jimmy Kimmel's show after heated clash. The Jimmy Kimmel live studio in Los Angeles buzzed with anticipation, a vibrant hum of energy pulsing through the packed audience as the house lights dimmed and the iconic theme music blared through the speakers. The crowd, a mix of locals and tourists clutching their free tickets, leaned forward in their seats, their chatter fading into an expectant hush. Tonight's main guest was no ordinary celebrity. He was John Kennedy, the seasoned U.S. Senator from Louisiana, a man known for his sharp wit and unyielding principles. Kennedy had agreed to appear on the show to promote a new community initiative, a grassroots effort aimed at supporting small businesses in rural areas, a cause close to his heart. The senator, with his distinctive Southern drawl and no-nonsense demeanor, was a rare booking for a late-night talk show, and the producers knew they had a chance to make waves. Backstage, the atmosphere was less celebratory, crackling with an undercurrent of tension that only a few could sense. Kennedy's longtime aide, Ellen, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for reading situations, paced near the green room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She'd been with Kennedy for years, navigating the chaos of political campaigns and media circuses, and she knew her boss better than most. Earlier that day, she'd pulled aside the show's lead producer, a wiry man named Greg, and laid down the law in her calm but firm tone. "Don't try to make him a punchline," she'd said, her eyes locked on Greg's. "He's here to talk about the initiative, not to play your games." Greg had nodded, flashing a practiced smile. But Ellen caught the glint in his eye, the kind that screamed he was already plotting a viral moment. She knew the type, producers who saw guests as props, not people, and she'd warned Kennedy on the drive over. "They're gonna try something." "John," she'd said, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Kennedy, staring out the window at the neon blur of Hollywood Boulevard, had only grunted, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee, a subtle sign he was already sizing up the battlefield. Inside the green room, Kennedy sat alone, a stark contrast to the glitzy chaos just beyond the door. The room was a standard talk show setup: plush couch, a tray of bottled water and snacks, a flat-screen monitor playing the live feed of the show. Kennedy, dressed in a crisp navy suit with a red tie, nursed a black coffee, his posture relaxed but alert, like a hunter waiting for the first rustle in the brush. On the monitor, Jimmy Kimmel was in top form, his monologue slicing through the latest headlines with razor-sharp quips that had the audience roaring. A joke about a pop star's latest meltdown landed particularly well, the crowd erupting in laughter as Jimmy grinned and adjusted his tie. Kennedy's expression didn't shift, his hazel eyes fixed on the screen, studying Kimmel's rhythm, the way he worked the room. Ellen, slipping into the green room to check on him, caught the look and knew what it meant. "They're gonna push you," she muttered, adjusting her earpiece. Kennedy gave a slight nod, setting his coffee down with a deliberate clink. "Let 'em try," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a man who'd faced tougher opponents than a talk show host. The stage manager, a young woman with a clipboard and a nervous smile, poked her head in. "5 minutes, Senator," she said, her voice chipper but strained. Kennedy rose, straightening his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate, exuding a quiet authority that filled the room. Ellen followed him to the curtain, her mind racing through the briefing she'd given him earlier. She'd studied Kimmel's show, knew his tendency to lean into humor at the expense of substance, especially with guests who didn't fit the Hollywood mold. Kennedy wasn't here to banter about viral memes or play along with some scripted skit he'd made that cleared to everyone from his team to the producers. But Ellen had seen the rundown, a flimsy sheet of paper Greg had reluctantly shared, and it included a segment labeled "Fun with the Senator," complete with a prop she hadn't been allowed to see. Her stomach twisted at the thought. "Stick to the initiative," she whispered as they reached the edge of the stage. Kennedy didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched, a fleeting sign he'd heard her. The studio was a different world, a dazzling assault of lights and sound that could disorient even the most seasoned performer. The audience, warmed up by a comedian during the pre-show, was primed for a spectacle, their energy a tangible force that seemed to press against the stage. Jimmy, seated behind his sleek desk, was wrapping up a bit about a new reality show, Flop, his delivery smooth, effortless, the crowd eating it up. He shifted gears seamlessly, his voice rising with excitement as he introduced the night's guest. Ladies and gentlemen, he's a U.S. Senator from Louisiana, here to talk about a new community initiative. Please welcome John Kennedy. The band, a tight ensemble, led by Cleto and the Cletones, launched into a lively riff heavy on brass, evoking a southern vibe that felt just shy of caricature. The crowd erupted, clapping and cheering, as Kennedy stepped through the curtain, his stride measured, his face composed but unreadable. He crossed the stage, the spotlight tracking his every move, and shook Jimmy's hand. A brief, firm grip that conveyed more than words could. Jimmy, all smiles, gestured to the guest chair, and Kennedy sat his frame tall and upright, his hands resting lightly on his knees. The cheers faded, replaced by a charged silence, the audience leaning in, sensing the weight of his presence. Jimmy, ever the showman, started with a safe opener, leaning forward with his trademark grin. "Senator, it's great to have you here. Tell us about this new initiative you're rolling out. It sounds like something that's really going to make a difference." The question was straightforward, designed to ease Kennedy into the conversation, and for a moment, it seemed like the segment might stay on track. Kennedy leaned in slightly, his voice steady, rich with the cadence of his Louisiana roots. "It's about giving small businesses a fighting chance." He began, his words deliberate, each one landing with purpose. "Folks in rural communities, they're the backbone of this country. This initiative gets them resources cuts, red tape, helps them stand tall against the big players." The audience listened, rapt, drawn in by his conviction, the way he spoke, not as a politician, but as someone who genuinely believed in the cause. For a few minutes, the interview hummed along at Kennedy, painting a vivid picture of struggling shop owners and farmers, the kind of people he'd met countless times back home. Jimmy nodded, asking follow-up questions about the initiative's funding and scope. His tone engaged but laced with the faintest hint of impatience. The producers watching from the control booth were already itching for something juicier, something that would trend on social media by morning. Greg, headset on, whispered to his assistant, "We need to spice this up." The plan was already in motion, a light-hearted bit designed to humanize Kennedy, as Greg had pitched it to the team. Ellen, stationed in the wings, caught a glimpse of a stagehand slipping something behind Jimmy's desk, and her jaw tightened. She couldn't see what it was, but she knew it wasn't part of the approved rundown. On stage, Jimmy sensed the moment slipping into earnest territory and decided to pivot. "So, Senator," he said, his grin widening, "you're out there fighting for the little guy, which is awesome. But let's have some fun. Do you ever get a chance to kick back? Maybe tell a few stories from the campaign trail?" The question was a soft lob meant to steer Kennedy toward a lighter anecdote, but the shift in tone was palpable. Kennedy's eyes narrowed just a fraction, a flicker of wariness crossing his face. He leaned back slightly, his fingers drumming once on his knee, the same subtle tick Ellen had noticed earlier. "I'm here to talk about the work," he said, his voice still calm but edged with a warning. "Folks don't need stories, they need solutions." The audience stirred, a mix of murmurs and scattered claps, some appreciating his focus, others craving the entertainment Jimmy was fishing for. Jimmy, undeterred, pressed on his smile, unwavering. "Come on, Senator, give us something. You've been in politics a long time. Bet you've got a funny moment or two." The crowd chuckled, egging him on, but Kennedy didn't bite. "Funny's not what keeps communities alive," he said, his tone sharper now, cutting through the studio's hum. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy tension, the kind that makes your skin prickle. Ellen, watching from the sidelines, muttered under her breath, "Here we go." She knew that tone, had heard it in countless meetings, when Kennedy sensed someone trying to pull him off course. Jimmy, oblivious to the shift, leaned forward, reaching for a prop hidden behind his desk. A bright red campaign hat with a cartoonish logo, part of the fun, with the senator, bit the producers had cooked up. "All right, Senator, let's try this," Jimmy said, holding up the hat with a theatrical flourish. "How about you pop this on? Give us your best campaign speech." The audience laughed, clapping, some shouting encouragement caught up in the moment. But Kennedy didn't move, his stare locked on Jimmy, unblinking, like a hawk sizing up its prey. "Put it away," he said, his voice low, each word deliberate, carrying a weight that silenced the room. Jimmy's smile faltered. His hand, still holding the hat, caught off guard by the senator's refusal. The crowd's cheers dissolved into gasps and whispers, the energy shifting from playful to precarious. Backstage, Greg was barking orders into his headset, urging Jimmy to push through. But Ellen shook her head, her arms crossed tightly. She'd seen Kennedy in high-stakes debates, watched him dismantle opponents with that same steely resolve. And she knew this wasn't going to end the way the producers hoped. On stage, the silence stretched heavy and suffocating, the cameras still rolling, capturing every second of the standoff. Jimmy, trying to salvage the moment, set the hat down with a forced chuckle. Okay, no hats tonight," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. But the damage was done. The audience was on edge, and Kennedy's expression hadn't softened. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm but unyielding. "I came here to talk about something that matters," he said, his eyes sweeping the set, the lights, the crowd. "Not to play dress-up for laughs." The words landed like a gavel, and the studio erupted, some clapping in support. Others murmuring in confusion, unsure whether this was part of the show. Jimmy's smile tightened, his fingers tapping the desk, a telltale sign he was losing his grip on the segment. He glanced at the floor producer, a harried woman signaling him to pivot, but the senator wasn't done. "You think this is what people want?" Kennedy continued, gesturing at the bright lights, the polished set. "They want real talk, not a circus." The crowd's reaction was split, half cheering, half shifting uncomfortably, the divide growing sharper with every word. Ellen in the wings nodded to herself, a grim satisfaction settling over her. She'd warned them, and now the producers were getting exactly what they'd invited. The stage manager hovered nearby, whispering to Greg through her headset, but the control booth was in chaos. The director torn between cutting to commercial and letting the drama play out for the ratings. On stage, Jimmy tried to steer back to the initiative, asking a rushed question about its timeline, but Kennedy's stare didn't waver, and the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, once a beacon of lighthearted fun, was now a powder keg, and John Kennedy was holding the match. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio, still reeling from the tense standoff in the opening segment, crackled with a restless energy as the cameras stayed trained on John Kennedy and Jimmy Kimmel. The audience, a mix of die-hard fans and curious onlookers, shifted in their seats, their murmurs a low hum that pulsed through the brightly lit set. Senator Kennedy sat upright in the guest chair, his navy suit crisp, his hands resting lightly on his knees, but his eyes, sharp and unyielding, never left Jimmy. The red campaign hat, now discarded on the desk, sat like a silent taunt. Reminder of the misstep that had shifted the interview from cordial to combustible. Jimmy, his smile strained but still plastered on, leaned forward, trying to reset the mood. "All right, Senator, let's get back to it," he said, his voice a touch too bright, like a man trying to steer a runaway train back onto the tracks. The crowd chuckled nervously, sensing the undercurrent of tension, their phones already out, some recording, others tweeting snippets of the clash. Backstage, Kennedy's aide Ellen stood in the wings, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She'd seen the senator in high-pressure situations, before town halls, Senate hearings, but this was different. The glitz of Hollywood, the pressure of live TV, and Jimmy's relentless push for entertainment were a volatile mix, and she knew Kennedy wasn't here to play along. In the control booth, producer Greg was barking orders, his headset crackling. "Keep it rolling, but Jimmy, lighten it up," he hissed, his eyes glued to the monitors. The ratings were spiking, but the segment was teetering on the edge of disaster, and Greg's gamble to turn Kennedy into a viral moment was starting to look like a costly mistake. Jimmy, sensing the need to regain control, pivoted back to the community initiative, hoping to ground the conversation in something safe. "So, Senator, you mentioned helping small businesses," he said, glancing at his cue cards. "Can you tell us more about how this plan's gonna work for, say, a family-owned store in Louisiana?" It was a solid question, one that played to Kennedy's strengths, and for a moment, it seemed like the interview might stabilize. Kennedy leaned in, his voice steady, carrying the weight of his conviction. "It's simple," he said, his southern drawl cutting through the studio's hum. "You give folks access to loans, training, and fair markets. You cut the bureaucracy that strangles them. A store like that, it's not just a business, it's a family's life, their legacy." The audience listened, some nodding, drawn in by the sincerity in his words. A few clapped their support genuine, but the room remained divided, with others still buzzing from the earlier clash, craving more drama. Jimmy nodded, his expression attentive, but his fingers tapped the desk, a subtle sign he was already planning his next move. The producers had prepped him for a lighter segment, something to loosen up the senator, and despite the warning signs, Jimmy was determined to deliver. "Love that passion." Senator Jimmy said, his grin widening as he shifted gears. "But let's have a little fun with this. You're out there fighting for these businesses. Ever thought about running one yourself? Maybe a lemonade stand?" The crowd laughed, the suggestion absurd but playful, meant to coax Kennedy into a humorous riff. But Kennedy's expression didn't budge, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "I'm not here to play make-believe," he said, his voice low but firm, each word deliberate. "Those families aren't selling lemonade. They're fighting to keep their doors open." The laughter died, replaced by a ripple of gasps and uneasy murmurs. The audience was split. Some clapped, admiring Kennedy's resolve, while others shifted uncomfortably, wanting the light-hearted vibe Jimmy was chasing. Ellen, watching from the wings, muttered under her breath, "Told you, Greg." She'd warned the producers not to push him, but they'd ignored her, and now the senator was drawing a line in the sand. Jimmy, caught off guard, but quick on his feet, tried to salvage the moment with a chuckle. Fair enough," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No lemonade stands for you." The crowd laughed again, but it was thinner, less certain, the tension in the room palpable. In the control booth, Greg was pacing, his voice sharp in the director's ear. "Get him to play along." "Jimmy, come on!" The plan was to transition into a pre-scripted bit, a mock campaign rally, where Kennedy would read funny slogans from cue cards, a segment designed to go viral. The stagehands had already set up a small podium behind the desk, hidden from view, and Jimmy was supposed to spring it on Kennedy as a surprise. But the senator's refusal to engage was throwing a wrench in the plan, and Jimmy's patience was wearing thin. He leaned forward, his tone still playful, but with an edge. "All right, Senator, let's try something else. You're a pro at speeches. How about a quick one for the folks at home?" something to rally the troops. He gestured to the audience, egging them on, and the crowd responded with cheers, some shouting. Speech, speech. Kennedy didn't move, his posture rigid, his stare locked on Jimmy. I don't do speeches for applause, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. I speak when there's something worth saying. The studio went quiet, the weight of his words settling over the room. A few audience members clapped their support loud in the silence, but others whispered, unsure whether this was part of the show or a genuine rebuke. Jimmy's smile faltered, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. He was used to steering interviews, charming even the toughest guests, but Kennedy was a different beast, unbending, unafraid to call out the game. Ellen in the wings shook her head, her expression a mix of pride and worry. She knew Kennedy could handle himself, but she also knew the producers wouldn't let this slide. Sure enough, Greg was on his headset, urging Jimmy to push harder. Don't let him take over. Jimmy, get to the podium bit. Jimmy, sensing the segment slipping away, decided to double down. He stood breaking the host's unwritten rule of staying seated and walked around the desk, gesturing to the hidden podium. Come on, Senator. We've got a little surprise for you, he said, his voice upbeat but strained. We set up a campaign rally just for fun. Give us one line, something to fire up the crowd. The band kicked in with a quick drum roll and the audience cheered, caught up in the theatrics. A stagehand rolled out the podium adorned with a mock campaign sign that read, Kennedy for the people. The crowd laughed, some clapping, but Kennedy remained seated, his expression unreadable, his hands still on his knees. I'm not your prop, he said, his voice low, but carrying a quiet fury that silenced the room. The cheers faded, replaced by a stunned hush. The audience, frozen phones still recording, capturing every second of the standoff. Jimmy, now standing awkwardly beside the podium, tried to laugh it off. Okay, no rally today, he said, waving to the stagehand to remove the podium. But the crowd was restless, their energy jagged, split between those who admired Kennedy's defiance and those who wanted the fun Jimmy had promised. In the control booth, Greg was livid, his voice a harsh whisper. He's killing the segment, Jimmy. Get him back on track. Ellen, watching from the wings, stepped closer to the stage manager, her voice sharp. You're gonna regret this. She snapped, her eyes on Greg's silhouette in the booth. On stage, Jimmy returned to his chair, his smile gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression. He picked up a cue card, trying to pivot back to the initiative. Let's talk more about your plans, Senator, he said, his tone professional but clipped. What's the next step for these businesses? It was a desperate attempt to reset, but Kennedy wasn't letting it go. You don't get it, Kennedy said, leaning forward, his voice steady but laced with steel. I came here to talk about real people, real problems, not to be your circus act. The audience erupted, some standing, shouting support. Tell him, Senator, while others booed, frustrated by the derailment of their entertainment. Jimmy's face flushed, his fingers tapping the desk rapidly, now a clear sign he was losing his cool. He leaned in, his voice sharper, dropping the nice guy act. Look, Senator, we're just trying to have a good time here, he said, gesturing to the crowd. The folks came for a show, not a lecture. The words were a challenge, direct and unfiltered, and the audience felt it, their noise spiking, a mix of cheers and jeers, swallowing the set. Kennedy's eyes narrowed, his posture unchanged, but the air around him seemed to tighten, like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Ellen in the wings muttered a curse, her hands clenched. She'd seen Kennedy take on opponents with that same intensity, but this was live TV, and the stakes were different. The control booth was chaos, Greg yelling to prep a commercial break. But the director, sensing the ratings, Gold overruled him. Let it play out. He barked, his eyes on the spiking viewership numbers. On stage, Kennedy leaned back, crossing his arms, his face a mask of resolve. A show, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. That's what this is to you. A show. Not to the people I'm fighting for. The crowd roared, the divide sharper now, some chanting Kennedy's name, others heckling the studio, a cauldron of noise. Jimmy, scrambling, tried to pivot again, picking up another cue card. His voice rushed. All right, let's talk about the impact of your initiative. He started, but Kennedy cut him off, his tone unyielding. You're not listening, he said, his words slicing through the chaos. This isn't about your ratings. It's about respect. The studio froze, the weight of his statement hanging in the air, and for a split second, it was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for the next move in a battle neither man was willing to lose. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was a live wire, the air thick with tension as Senator John Kennedy and Jimmy Kimmel faced off their clash, now a full-blown spectacle. The audience, a restless sea of faces under the glaring studio lights, was split, half enthralled by Kennedy's unyielding defiance, half frustrated by the derailment of their expected entertainment. The mock campaign podium hastily rolled off a stage left a void that seemed to amplify the standoff, with Kennedy seated, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Jimmy like a prosecutor staring down a witness. His last words, "This isn't about your ratings. It's about respect," hung heavy, igniting the crowd into a frenzy of cheers, boos, and scattered chants of Kennedy. Kennedy, Jimmy, his face flushed, sat behind his desk, his fingers gripping the edge, the remnants of his signature grin replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. He was no stranger to tough guests, but Kennedy's refusal to play ball had turned his stage into a battleground, and the cameras, still rolling, captured every second for a stunned audience at home. Backstage, Kennedy's aide Ellen stood in the wings, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of steely pride and mounting concern. She'd seen the senator take on bigger challenges, but the chaos of live TV was unpredictable, and the producers' missteps were fueling a fire she'd warned them about. In the control booth, producer Greg was a whirlwind of panic, his headset crackling with orders. Jimmy, shut it down, or push back. Don't let him run the show. He barked, his eyes darting between monitors, showing skyrocketing ratings, and the director's strained face. The segment was a runaway train, and Greg's gamble for a viral moment had backfired spectacularly. Jimmy, his pride stung, leaned forward, his voice sharp, the nice guy facade crumbling. "Senator, with all due respect, you're on my stage," he said, his words clipped, his gesture to the audience a plea for support. "These folks came to have fun, and we invited you here to share your story. How about meeting us halfway?" The crowd roared, some clapping for Jimmy, others shouting for Kennedy to hold his ground, their phones recording the moment already spiraling across social media. Kennedy didn't flinch, his hazel eyes narrowing, his southern drawl cutting through the noise like a blade. "Your stage," he said, his voice low but resonant, each syllable deliberate. "I'm here because I chose to be, not to dance for your crowd." The audience erupted, the divide sharpening. Some stood cheering Kennedy's resolve, while others jeered, craving the light-hearted banter Jimmy had promised. Ellen in the wings muttered under her breath, "That's it, John," her hands clenched, knowing the senator was doubling down, turning the interview into a referendum on authenticity. Jimmy's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping the desk in a rapid, nervous rhythm. He glanced at the floor producer, a harried woman signaling frantically to wrap the segment, but the control booth was in chaos, the director overruling Greg's pleas for a commercial break. "This is gold. Keep it rolling." The director snapped his eyes on the viewership numbers climbing by the second. Jimmy, caught between his instincts as a host and the pressure to reclaim his stage, tried a new angle, his tone a mix of defiance and forced calm. "Look, Senator, nobody's saying your work isn't important," he said, spreading his hands, appealing to the crowd. "But this is TV. People want to see the real you, not just the policy wonk. Give us something, anything to show you're human." The audience laughed, some clapping, but the attempt to lighten the mood fell flat. The room too charged to pivot. Kennedy leaned forward. His hands clasped, his voice steady, but laced with fire. "You want real," he said, his gaze piercing. "Real is the folks I'm fighting for, families losing everything because the system's rigged. Not this." He gestured at the set, the bright lights, the polished desk, his words a direct challenge to the entire machine. The crowd exploded, some shouting support. "Tell him, Senator," while others booed the noise, swallowing the studio. Ellen, watching from the sidelines, shook her head, her expression grim. She'd warned Greg not to push Kennedy, but the producers had seen him as a prop, not a person, and now they were paying the price. On stage, Jimmy's patience snapped. He stood again, his voice rising, no longer masking his frustration. "Senator, we're trying to give you a platform here," he said, pointing at Kennedy, his tone bordering on confrontational. "You want to talk respect? How about respecting the people who brought you on this show?" The audience gasped, the challenge raw and unfiltered, the studio shaking with their reaction, half cheering for Jimmy's pushback, half chanting Kennedy's name. Kennedy rose slowly, his height and presence commanding the stage, his movements deliberate like a man staking claim to his ground. "Respect's earned," he said, stepping closer to Jimmy, his voice low but cutting each word a hammer. "Not bought with applause or lights." The crowd lost it, the noise deafening a mix of roars and jeers that seemed to shake the set itself. Phones were up, recording the moment already, a wildfire online. Backstage, two security guards in black shirts edged closer to the stage, their hands twitching, their eyes on Kennedy. Ellen stepped forward, her voice sharp as she grabbed the stage manager's arm. "Don't you dare touch him!" She snapped, her glare fierce enough to make the manager back off. In the control booth, Greg was yelling, "Get him off, now!" But the director, mesmerized by the ratings, shook his head. "Let it play," he said, his voice calm but greedy. On stage, Jimmy, now face to face with Kennedy, took a step back, his hands raised, trying to de-escalate. "All right, Senator, you've made your point," he said, his voice tight, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. He gestured to the crowd, hoping to rally them. "Let's give it up for Senator John Kennedy, folks." Some clapped, but the applause was drowned by shouts, the room too divided to unite. Kennedy didn't acknowledge the gesture, his stare still fixed on Jimmy, his expression unreadable, like a man weighing whether to say more. The floor producer, sweating, signaled security to move, in her voice urgent. "We need him off. Jimmy's losing it." One guard, a burly man with a cautious demeanor, stepped onto the stage, raising a hand toward Kennedy. "Sir, let's take a walk," he said, his tone respectful but firm. Kennedy turned, his eyes locking onto the guard, and for a moment, the studio seemed to freeze, the crowd holding its breath. "Don't," Kennedy said, his voice quiet, but commanding, not a threat, but a statement of fact. The guard stopped, hands up, backing off his face, a mix of respect and uncertainty. Ellen pushed through the wings, her voice cutting through the din. "He leaves when he's ready," she snapped, glaring at the producer. Kennedy raised a hand, silencing her, his gaze sweeping the set, the audience, the cameras. "I said what I came to say," he told the room, his voice steady, final, carrying the weight of a man who'd drawn his line. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off stage. his stride slow, deliberate. The crowd erupting in a chaotic mix of cheers, boos, and stunned murmurs. Jimmy was left standing alone, the band scrambling to play a brassy fill to cover the void, the house lights dimming slightly as the monitors flashed to a commercial break. He forced a smile, waving to the crowd, his voice shaky. "Well, that was something, huh?" he said, trying to spin it into a joke. But the laughter was uneven, the energy fractured. Backstage, the producers were in meltdown, Greg yelling about damage control, the director still glued to the ratings muttering, "This'll be everywhere tomorrow." Ellen followed Kennedy to the green room where he grabbed his coat, calm as ever, his face distant already past the chaos. "Told him not to push you," she muttered, adjusting her earpiece. Kennedy nodded, his eyes on the door, his silence louder than the uproar he'd left behind. Outside, the internet was ablaze, clips of the clash going viral, fans and critics picking sides, the moment already overshadowing the initiative he'd come to promote. The studio buzzed with fallout, the audience still arguing among themselves, some chanting Kennedy's name, others demanding Jimmy fight back. The Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, once a bastion of polished entertainment, was now a battlefield, and John Kennedy had walked away unbroken, leaving a mark that wouldn't fade anytime soon. The Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was a smoldering wreck in the wake of Senator John Kennedy's dramatic walk, off the once vibrant energy, now a tangled mix of awe and unease. The audience, still reeling, whispered and argued among themselves, some chanting Kennedy's name, others muttering about the ruined show. Jimmy Kimmel stood alone on stage, his forced smile barely masking the strain as he clapped his hands, trying to rally the crowd for the next segment. "Well, that was one for the books, folks," he said, his voice thin, coaxing a weak chuckle from the crowd. The band launched into a brassy filler, but it couldn't drown out the chaos. The monitors flickered to commercials ads for soda and car rentals, offering a brief respite for the crew to scramble. Backstage, the control booth was a storm of panic. Producer Greg yanked off his headset, his face flushed as he shouted at the director, "We let him hijack the show. This is a mess." The director, cool under pressure, pointed at the monitors displaying soaring ratings. "Mess. We're breaking records. This is everywhere by morning." He was right. Online clips of Kennedy's clash with Jimmy were exploding across social media, racking up millions of views with captions like "Kennedy schools Kimmel" and "Senator Tank's talk show fun." The internet was a war zone, and the story was only beginning. In the green room, Senator Kennedy moved with quiet purpose, slipping on his coat, as if the uproar outside didn't exist. His aide Ellen stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning her phone as notifications flooded in. "Told Greg they'd regret this," she muttered, her voice laced with grim satisfaction. Kennedy glanced at her, his expression calm, almost detached. "They wanted a spectacle," he said, his southern drawl steady. "They got it." He picked up his briefcase and headed for the exit, Ellen at his side, her heels clicking on the polished floor. Outside, the Los Angeles night was crisp, the studio's neon glow fading as they slid into a waiting car. The driver, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed silent, his eyes flicking to Kennedy in the rearview mirror. Ellen scrolled through her phone, her brow furrowing. "You're trending everywhere," she said, glancing at him. "Half the web's calling you a legend. The other half says you're too stiff." Kennedy stared out the window, the city lights blurring past his silence, a wall that needed no words. Back in the studio, Jimmy limped through the rest of the show, his usual polish dulled by the clash. A comedian's stand-up set landed unevenly, the audience too distracted to laugh heartily, and a planned game segment fizzled, the energy sapped. Jimmy's closing remarks were curt, sidestepping the incident with a vague nod to lively guests. "That's why we love live TV," he quipped, his grin forced. The crowd's applause was polite, but tepid, and as the credits rolled, they spilled out their chatter, a mix of excitement and debate. The production team huddled in a tense debrief, Greg still seething, pointing fingers at everyone from the writers to Jimmy. "We should have prepped for this guy's attitude," he snapped. The director, sipping water, shrugged. "Attitude or not, we're the top story tonight." The numbers didn't lie, viewership had spiked, and the viral clips were fueling a media frenzy, turning the clash into a cultural lightning rod. Online, the reaction was a tidal wave. Kennedy's supporters flooded platforms, hailing his stand as a rebuke of shallow entertainment. About time someone stood up to these talk show games, one comment read, amassing thousands of upvotes. Critics, meanwhile, called him rigid, out of touch with the format. "It's a comedy show, not a Senate hearing," another user posted, sparking heated threads. News sites pounced, some framing Kennedy as a beacon of principle, others as a guest who'd overstepped. His community initiative support for rural small businesses got brief mentions, but the drama dominated. Senator Storm's off Kimmel screamed one headline. The viral clips, chopped into memes and reaction videos, spread faster than policy talk ever could, a stark lesson in media's love for spectacle. The divide online echoed deeper tensions, those who craved authenticity versus those who wanted escapism. Jimmy's team scrambled to manage the fallout. The show's social media was swamped, some praising Jimmy's poise, others slamming him for pushing Kennedy too far. Greg pushed for a public apology, but the PR team nixed it, fearing it would keep the story alive. Jimmy, privately rattled, admitted to a staffer he'd misread Kennedy. "Thought he'd at least play a little," he said, rubbing his neck. The crew leaned on the ratings win, promoting upcoming episodes to shift focus, but the incident left a mark, a rare chink in Jimmy's armor. Kennedy unfazed Dove back into his work meeting with local leaders to push his initiative, his focus unbroken. Ellen ensured the policy got some coverage, slipping talking points to friendly outlets. "Let them talk about the drama," she told her team. "We'll get the real message out." Kennedy's allies saw his stand as a win for integrity, while detractors called him inflexible. The split reflecting a broader clash of values. The incident became a mirror, reflecting how we engage with each other. Kennedy's defiance showed that respect is earned, not owed, a stand for those whose stories get drowned in noise. But it also showed the cost his message was buried under the drama, suggesting that a touch of adaptability can amplify impact without sacrificing principle. For viewers, the lesson was clear. True dialogue starts with listening, not performing. Respect means seeing people as they are, not as props for our agendas. In a world hooked on flash, the story urged us to seek substance, to value the work behind the headlines, and to build bridges through understanding. Kennedy's exit wasn't just a moment. It was a call to speak with purpose, listen with care, and honor the truths we share, a quiet challenge to be better in every conversation.